Welcome to another wonderful Susannah Calloway audiobook. We are excited to have you with us. Before we begin the story, please like and subscribe to our channel and share it with friends. This allows us to continue adding free clean Western romance audiobooks for you to enjoy. The following title is copyrighted by Susannah Calloway, Western romance author. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and enjoy the story. Defending the Widow. Chapter 1. Cantering his black and white pinto down the ravine, Shield scanned the ground for the elk tracks he had spotted higher up. The cold of autumn was imminent, especially in the high mountains, and he hoped to take back at least 2 elk to his tribe. With winter coming on, he and his people would need the hides and the meat they would bring. However, he had little desire to travel further down out of the mountains where the white men's villages were. Climbing out of the ravine, he found the tracks again. Yet, they headed down, toward the foothills where Shield knew they sought the lush grazing in the meadows. Torn between trying to catch up to them or hunt elsewhere, he muttered in his native Cheyenne, "I must stay clear of the white man. Perhaps I should go back." Deciding to continue on for a time, however, he rode further down the mountain, following a clear rushing creek. Thinking he rode faster than the elk, he hoped he might catch a glimpse of them if they wandered out into the open. Ducking under the stiff branches of pine trees, he listened to the sharp screech of a hunting hawk. His horse jumped dead logs, long since turned white with age, and dodged moss-covered boulders protruding from the loamy soil. Reining in, he bent out of his saddle, peering intently at the tracks. They seemed fresher. The elk had passed this way perhaps less than an hour ago. He could not see through the dense forest of pine, aspen, and scrub oak to observe the foothills or the plains in the distance. Deciding to venture further down, Shield nudged his pinto into a trot. Upon reaching the edge of the forest with the foothills spreading out below, he saw 3 elk grazing about a quarter of a mile away. Reining, he quickly dismounted and pulled his rifle from its scabbard. Tying his horse to a tree, Shield tested the wind, discovering he would need to circle around them to avoid the beasts catching his scent. Using bramble thickets and scrub oak for cover, he crept noiselessly from thicket to thicket, keeping his eyes on the elk. The bull occasionally lifted his great antlered head to scout for danger, then returned to his grazing. Shield froze whenever they ceased their browsing on the still green grass, but the elk seemed to not realize he was there. At last he found a good position with which to aim his rifle with a sure chance of taking the bull down. Keeping his breathing slow and even, he socked the rifle to his shoulder, and peered down the barrel. The elk's huge shoulder loomed large in his sight. Shield started to squeeze the trigger. A savage snarling burst from behind him. Something large and strong struck him in the back, and his rifle barked. Fangs bit deep into his flesh as he swung around to fight whatever it was that attacked him. Using his gun as a weapon, he tried to whip it at the wild dog that dropped from him only to leap for his throat. 2 more lunged from the brush as he lost his grip on the rifle. Using his fists, he struck at the dogs, but they ripped into his legs and his arms, trying to use their combined weight to bring him down. Near panic, Shield fought them, gripping one around the throat in an attempt to strangle it as its fangs caught the flesh of his neck and slashed downward. He tried to use the body of the dog in his hands as a shield from the other 2 as they lunged at his belly. He kicked one in the ribs, making it yelp, but his blow did not stop it for long. Backing into the thicket so they could no longer come at him from the rear, Shield tightened his grip on the dog's throat even as the other 2 snarled and chewed into the body of their pack mate. That one yelped shrilly, fighting to get loose from his hands. One of the others ducked low and drove its fangs deep into his left thigh. "I am dead." The sound of a shot reached him at the same instant one of the dogs screamed, thrashing on the ground, kicking and biting at the soil. Another tried to flee but was also shot before reaching the shelter of the trees. Shield flung the 3rd dog from him, throwing it onto its back, forcing sharp yelps from it as it tried to escape. It too died at the hands of whoever saved his life. Peering through the blood that ran down his face, Shield saw 2 young white men emerge from the thickets and walk toward him. Bleeding from dozens of bites and slashes, Shield knew he still could die from either his wounds or at the hands of his enemies. He staggered to his feet, then went down hard. The sky above him spun around in a circle as he gazed up, feeling the darkness merge into the blue. He heard the rustling of the scrub oak as the two stepped toward him, and from the corner of his eye, he saw them lift their rifles. So, they kill me. The last thing he saw was their faces peering down at him as he dropped into the darkness. Chapter 2. Rebecca Reilly, perspiring under her sunbonnet and gown, plucked beans from their stalks and put them in the basket at her feet. She had worked her way down the rows for most of the day, and soon it would be time to go inside the ranch house and make supper. Her two boys, David and Noah, had gone out hunting, hoping to bring in an elk or deer. Winter was coming, and they needed to stock up on food to see them through. Once the snows came this close to the mountains, travel grew difficult. Taking a moment to stretch her back, Rebecca gazed around at the tidy ranch with the sprawling wood and brick house, supporting a large roofed veranda with tree trunks for pillars. To her right stood the huge barn. Attached to it was a wide corral with a dozen horses with their noses to the dirt, searching for the last pieces of hay from their previous feeding. Beyond the buildings rose the mountains. They still amazed her with their beauty even after living here for the last 18 years. Swiping small beads of sweat from her brow with the back of her hand, Rebecca caught a glimpse of horses moving through the trees, heading downhill from the higher elevations. Certain it was David and Noah returning from the hunt, she frowned slightly. But a third horse, a black and white pinto, followed behind them. Where did that one come from? We don't have any pintos. Sensing trouble, Rebecca picked up her nearly full basket of plucked beans and strode quickly toward the house. Setting it on the porch, she walked toward the trail that led into both the mountains and the remainder of the over 500-acre ranch. Noah, in the lead, waved to her, and that was when she saw the third man on the pinto. He rode slumped over the horse's neck, clearly limp and unconscious, his clothing covered in dark blood. Rebecca's hand went to her throat. He was an Indian. "Boys," she called. "What happened?" David led the pinto by its reins, occasionally glanced at the Indian to make sure he didn't slide off. "Wild dogs attacked him, Ma," he replied, his voice already deep and rolling in his 17 years. "He's hurt pretty bad," Noah added, his own voice alternating between the light tenor of a boy to the deeper tones he would achieve in manhood. "Take him straight to the house," Rebecca told them, rushing forward as they reached the ranch buildings. She paced beside the pinto and lifted the Indian's face, finding his flesh very pale. Yet, the man still breathed, and his heartbeat was steady under her fingers. "He's lost a lot of blood. Put him in the back bedroom while I fetch my kit." "Yes, ma'am." David and Noah reined in beside the steps of the veranda as Rebecca hurried up them, picking up her basket as she went. In the days before her marriage to her late husband, Timothy Reilly, she had worked at a hospital in New York as a nurse. She still maintained a wooden box of needles, catgut, and a variety of herbs that aided the healing of the sick and injured. Both strong boys, her sons lugged the Indian in through the front door, and down the short hall to the smallest bedroom. She and Timothy had built it with the anticipation of another child, but it was not to be. Rebecca never conceived again, and Timothy died a year ago. She stood against the far wall as they set the man down on the bed. "Good Lord," she muttered, seeing the numerous bites and slashes on the Indian's arms and legs. She peered closely at the wicked gash on his throat, not far from his jugular. "David," she ordered, pulling scissors from her kit, "I need hot water from the stove, and cloths to clean his wounds." "Noah, start cutting strips of linen for bandages." "Yes, ma'am," they said in unison, then departed the room. Busy cutting his deer hide vest away from his torso, Rebecca also studied his face. Despite the pale tinge to his coppery skin, he appeared in her estimation to be a strikingly good-looking man. His nose was hawk-like, his cheekbones high, and his chin strong and narrow. Black hair fell well past his shoulders, and he had tied an eagle feather into it. She cut away most of his leather leggings, exposing his bitten legs while still maintaining his privacy. By the time she tossed his bloody clothes into a heap on the floor, David had returned with a basin full of hot water, cloths, and a bottle of iodine. Good, she said. Now I am going to need your help, son. What can I do? Start threading a needle with the catgut. Washing the blood from the stranger's neck, Rebecca examined it closely. If we but suture this, she murmured, it should heal just fine. Before accepting the needle from David, she liberally poured iodine in the wound, then hummed to herself as she sewed. Take a cloth and start cleaning those cuts on his arms. Working together, she and David washed and stitched the Indian's ragged bites, Rebecca often clicking her tongue over the savagery of them. Did you kill the dogs? She asked, glancing at her son. David nodded. Yes, and I think now they were the ones who killed those 2 calves, not wolves like we thought. Good. At least now we won't have to hunt them down. Noah entered the room with his hands full of bandages. Will he be all right, Ma? I think so, Rebecca replied, placing her fingers at the Indian's throat, feeling his strong pulse. Good thing you boys got to him in time, or the dogs would have killed him. Noah stared down. He's the first Indian I ever seen. Ever saw, Rebecca corrected. Noah, you'll have to start chores by yourself. David will be out to help you when he's finished helping me. Yes, ma'am. Taking a moment to sit back, Rebecca watched him leave the room, a tall boy who had inherited her auburn hair and green eyes, a scattering of freckles across his cheeks. David, on the other hand, was the spitting image of his father, Timothy, with shaggy blonde hair and blue eyes, already as tall as his father was. Their father's untimely death had turned them both into men before they had even reached adulthood. Both took up the responsibilities of running the ranch and its 400 head of cattle that brought in the income the family sorely needed after Tim died the previous year. Together, they rounded up and branded the calves, herded the yearlings to market, maintained the fences, and worked around the ranch making repairs or building sheds. All right, she said at last. Roll him onto his side so I can take a look at the wounds on his back. David complied, rolling the big man over so that Rebecca could inspect the bites on his back. Those, she decided, did not need to be stitched, so she cleaned and disinfected them. Now let's wrap his injuries up, she said as David settled him onto his back again. Glancing out the tiny window, Rebecca observed the sun had set behind the mountains. Though not quite dusk, long shadows lay across the land outside. Go ahead and help your brother with chores, Rebecca said. I can finish here. But I fear supper will be late. David nodded, but sat where he was for a moment, looking into her face. Are you still thinking of selling the place, Ma? He asked, his tone soft. She gazed back steadily. Thinking, yes, but I have not made any decision yet. Why? I don't want you to, he replied. You and Pa built this from nothing. You can't just up and sell it, it's like Pa's legacy or something. It is also more work than the 3 of us can handle, David, she replied, her voice gentle. He stood. I don't care how much work it is, Ma. Noah and I can do it. I know you can, son. The question is whether or not you should. Chapter 3. Drifting in and out of consciousness, Shield wished the darkness would take him back down into its embrace. Horrible pain lanced through him, making him thrash and moan whenever he rose to the surface. Blinking, he tried to gaze around him, but the stiffness and agony in his neck prevented him from turning his head. He had no idea where he was or how he had gotten there. He knew it was night, as the nearly full moon glowed through the tiny window straight ahead of him. Closing his eyes, he let the weakness send him into blissful, pain-free oblivion for a time. Dreaming of wild beasts with gleaming red eyes and fangs dripping saliva, he jerked awake again, shutting his teeth against the pain. This time, he found a woman offering a spoon to his lips, her voice saying, "Here, this will help the pain." Accepting it, he swallowed and shut his eyes, drifting along the tides of unconsciousness, his agony dying to a whisper. This time when he slept, he did not dream. The next time he opened his eyes, full daylight streamed through the window. Roving his eyes around the chamber, he found it small, with a wooden table and a chair, and that he lay on a small bed, covered to his chin with a warm quilt. His pain had not yet woken with him, and for the time, his mind was fairly clear. Where am I? He vaguely remembered the two white men looming over him before the darkness took him down. He wondered if they had actually saved his life. Recalling the gunshots that killed the dogs, he supposed that perhaps they had taken him in and cared for his wounds. The door opened, and a white woman paused at the entrance, watching him carefully. She held a cup in one hand and a bottle in the other. Shield's eyes narrowed with suspicion as she finally strode toward him and sat in the chair beside the bed. "I hoped you were awake," she said, her brilliant green eyes staring into his. He could not look away from them. He had never seen such incredible eyes before. Her red-brown hair was braided and hung over her shoulder to her waist, her face the color of new milk. Even to his eyes, she was stunningly beautiful, and he was never one to admire a white woman. "I brought you some broth," she went on, holding up the cup. "And laudanum to help ease your pain. I don't know if you can understand me or not, but I cared for your wounds." Shield, his pain waking at last, lifted his arm from under the quilt and took the cup from her. Still suspicious, he sniffed it first, then drank it down in long swallows. Tasting of chicken, it eased the thirst he did not know he had and warmed his empty belly. The woman took the cup from him, and poured from the bottle into it, then gave it back. This stuff, the laudanum, tasted horrible, but he recognized the flavor as being the liquid she spooned into his mouth. He recalled how it killed his pain and helped him to sleep. She accepted the cup back from him and stood. "Sleep now," she said, her voice lulling him despite his distrust. "I changed your bandages while you slept, and I don't see any signs of infection. I will return later and bring you food." Watching her leave, Shield could not help but find her slender and graceful form intriguing. Before closing the door behind her, she offered him a small, tentative smile, then left him alone. The painkiller took effect shortly after, making his head spin and his drowsiness pull him back toward sleep. He let it take him down, grateful for the oblivion that held the pain at bay. When he woke next, the sun had begun to set behind the mountains. His pain woke as well, yet somehow it seemed he felt able to tolerate it better. Hoping it meant he was on his way to being healed, he tried to ease himself into a half-sitting position. Throwing the quilt back, he examined the bandaged wounds on his arms, chest, belly, and his legs. The dog bite on his thigh pained him almost as much as the one on his neck. He fingered the wrapping around his throat, recalling his close the mongrel had come to ripping his throat completely out. He tried flexing his leg, and almost cried out at the bolt of sharp agony that ripped through him. "You should be lying still." As a hunter always in tune to his surroundings, Shield gaped in shock that the woman had entered the room so silently he had not heard her, nor felt the air shift in the room. This time she held a small tray in her hand, and he scented the odor of hot beef emanate from it. Against his will, his stomach rumbled with hunger. The woman smiled as she set the tray on the table. "You look much stronger now," she said, sitting in the chair beside the bed to examine his wounds. "I am glad you are able to sit up and eat, for you need the nourishment to keep your strength up." Shield watched her carefully as she unwrapped the bandage on his thigh, thinking that she must be a healer, perhaps the medicine woman, of her people. He saw that the ragged bite had been sewn closed, with only slight redness and swollen flesh around it. "This one was deep," she said, her tone low as she reached for a bottle on the tray. The liquid she blotted onto the wound stung but was less than nothing compared to the pain of it when he moved. Her brilliant green eyes rested on his, and she smiled. "I will let you eat before your supper gets cold." Rising, she covered him back up with the quilt, then helped him to sit up with the pillows behind his back. Setting the tray on his lap, she once more left the room and him alone. He watched her go, amazed at her care of him. White people are ruthless enemies. Why is she going to such lengths to help me? His hunger took his mind off the questions, and he devoured the warm roast beef, bread with butter, beans, another cup of broth and one of clear cold water. The food settled into his stomach and made him feel a little stronger for it. It also made him sleepy, but he could not remove the tray from his lap without twisting his body and bringing on fresh agony. Fortunately, the woman returned and took it from him. Setting it on the floor, she once more sat in the chair. "My name is Rebecca Reilly," she said. "My sons killed the dogs that were attacking you and brought you here." "I am Hoananiva," Shield said, offering her a grave nod. "But I am also called Shield." Rebecca smiled. "A pleasure to meet you, Shield. Though I am surprised you speak English." "Yes, I speak your tongue." "I am glad you do, so you will understand what it is I am doing and know that I am not going to harm you." Shield raised a brow. "I suspect that if you wished me dead, would be already." "That is quite true." Rebecca slowly reached for the bandage around his neck and unwound it, closely inspecting the bite there. Dabbing more from the brown bottle onto it, she said, "This one is also pretty bad. It came close to killing you. An inch over and you would have bled to death. I sutured all the others that needed it and am keeping them clean. But if you can sit up, I need to take a look at the ones on your back." Gingerly, Shield leaned over as she stood up, bearing his vulnerable back to her, glad that he need not worry that she planned to plant a knife in it. After putting more liquid on his wounds, she helped him to lay back down. Oddly, the entire effort left him feeling weak and exhausted. She tucked the quilt up around him again. "I can bring you more laudanum, Shield," she said. "However, taking too much over a period of time is not healthy." "I can sleep without it," he replied, wondering if that was true. His movement made his barely healed wounds scream at him. "All right," she said, rising and picking up the tray. "If you cannot, just yell for me, I sleep in the next room. I will bring it to you." He nodded, closing his eyes as she left his room, closing the door behind her. Chapter 4. "How is he, Ma?" Noah asked, adding wood to the kitchen stove. Rebecca set the tray on the table and took Shield's dishes to the sink to wash after they had eaten their supper. "Much better, but his pain is still very bad." Noah grinned. "When can I go see him? Does he talk?" Rebecca found his fascination for the Indian in their home interesting, since David tended to worry that once he got well, he would turn on them and scalp them all. "Yes, he talks, and his name is Shield." "That's a neat name," Noah said, opening the oven door to pull the rest of the roast out. David took a knife and began to cut slices from it as Rebecca spooned hot beans into a bowl to set on the table. "Noah, are your hands washed?" "Yes, ma'am." "When can I go see him?" "Give him another day or two," she replied, also setting warm bread on the table. "Let him heal a little more. He will be here for a while, so you have plenty of time to visit." Sitting down to the table, Rebecca folded her hands as David said grace, adding her own silent prayer of thanks for Shield's continuing recovery. "Think other Indians will come looking for him, Ma?" David asked, passing her the plate of meat. "They might. They will be welcome to take him home with them, but he is in no condition to travel. Maybe they will think he is being held prisoner," he went on, his tone dark as he ate his supper. "And attack us." "I am sure Shield will not permit that to happen," Rebecca replied, amused. "He seems like a very nice man. Everyone in town says Indians are not to be trusted, and that they attack people for no reason." "I hear the Cheyenne are great warriors," Noah piped up. "I want to be like a warrior." "You already are, honey," Rebecca told him. "After all, you helped save his life by killing those dogs." He grinned. "That is really neat." David, ever practical and responsible, said, "I want Noah and me to go hunting again, Ma. We need to smoke some meat. Winter is a month or so away." "All right. Go tomorrow. Will you be safe here, alone with him while we're gone?" His blue eyes spoke more of his worry than his voice did. Rebecca sighed, both annoyed and amused. "Yes, I think I can defend myself against a man who cannot even rise from his bed." David flushed, staring at his plate. "What if he is tricking you?" "Believe me, he is not. I do appreciate you worrying about me, but he is as helpless as a new baby." David finally nodded. "I think the elk might have returned to the meadows in the hills." "Good. I am getting rather tired of beef lately, and elk would make a good change. The young pigs are almost ready for slaughter, Ma, Noah said, wiping his plate with a hunk of bread and shoving it into his mouth. I'm craving a nice juicy ham. Just be careful, boys, Rebecca said, rising from the table and picking up plates to wash. There might be more of those wild dogs around. If we see any, we'll shoot them, Noah said from behind her. Keep them from attacking the calves. Though her sons often helped her cook and serve dinner each night, Rebecca had long insisted that afterwards, she would wash the dishes while they go into the living room and read. With all the work they did, they had no time for schooling save the hour or two between supper and bed. By making them read books she ordered through the mail each month, she made sure they received something of an education. Thus, they went into the living room and built a fire in the great hearth, then sat near it to read as she heated water on the stove to wash. With her own chores done, she lit a lamp and took it down the hall to peek in on Shield. Opening the door enough to let the light fall upon him, she found him sound asleep. Closing it again, she fetched her darning and sat with the boys, sewing contentedly as they studied. The next morning, Shield seemed even stronger, and sat up himself when she arrived with his breakfast. Noah and David had left just after dawn to ride out on their hunting expedition, hurriedly downing the bacon and eggs she had prepared. Shield, too, ate with gusto, his deep brown eyes holding hers with that spark of suspicion she had observed the day before. How did you sleep? She asked, sitting down to wait for him to finish so she could replace his bandages. Restless at times, he admitted. The pain kept waking me up. Then I will dose you with laudanum tonight. Despite the distrust he apparently had for her, Rebecca still found him attractive and likable. She knew she couldn't hold his suspiciousness against him, for there had been many conflicts between her people and his. She enjoyed being with him, admired the play of his muscles beneath his coppery skin, and wondered what it might take to make him smile. Do you have a wife who will be worrying about you? She asked. He shook his head a tiny bit, crunching on the crispy bacon. I have not yet taken a wife. Will your people come to look for you? I don't know how we can get a message to them to inform them you are all right. They may in time, he said, though probably not for a while. My sons saw you hunting when the dogs attacked, she said, taking his empty plate from him. They went hunting today, hoping to get elk. Yes, we need to stock up on meat and hides for the coming winter. As do we. Now let me take a look at your wounds. Nodding with satisfaction to find them healing, albeit slowly, Rebecca stood up. Get some sleep if you can. I will be out working in the garden to bring in the vegetables I plan to put up in the cellar. I will be back in a few hours to bring you lunch. Her hand on the door handle, she heard him say, Thank you, Rebecca. Turning, she found a half smile on his handsome face, and returned it. You are welcome, Shield. Keeping the sun from her face with her bonnet, Rebecca worked pulling up carrots and onions, pulling beans and peas from the vines, and putting them all in baskets for washing and canning later. Though she tried not to, her thoughts kept returning to Shield, to his strong build and calm demeanor. His smile played in her mind, the kind of smile that made her heart quiver the tiniest bit in her chest. Carrying her baskets into the kitchen, she prepared cold beef sandwiches for them both, and took them into his room. He woke from a light doze when she entered, and carefully propped himself up to eat. Why do you care for me so? He asked, chewing his food. Finding the question puzzling, Rebecca tilted her head to the side. Why would I not? You are a white woman, he said, making a slight gesture toward her. I am an Indian. No matter the color of your skin, she replied, her tone tart. When I see a man in need, I will do my best to help him. Shield seemed more confused by her answer. I would not have saved the life of a white man. That is between you and your conscience, Shield, Rebecca said. It is my duty as a Christian to help others. I have heard of your Christian faith. Many of my people have died because of it. Perhaps others have been saved by it. It is always easier to remember the bad about folks than the good. But no matter what you say, I do not regret helping you. Another half-smile twitched his lips, his brown eyes intense. I'm glad you did, Rebecca. Chapter 5. The train's whistle blew a strident note as the chugging wheels slowed, announcing its arrival in town. Clyde Foster folded the paper he had been perusing and glanced out the window at the edge of the small town as it rolled into view. A wooden sign announced that he had just arrived in Miners Creek, Colorado. Not much of a place, he muttered, inspecting the wood-structured homes and the main street before turning his attention to the people waiting on the platform. As with most small towns in remote areas, the townsfolk clustered at the train station to await either passengers or the mail. This place was no different. One of his 3 companions stood up as the train rolled to a stop, yawning, then picked up his satchel from the floor near his chair. About time we got here, Fred commented sourly, peering through the window. It's a long way from Montana, added Sylvester, also standing. I hope they have a saloon here. Think they have a saloon here, Clyde? As Sylvester was a bit on the slow-thinking side, he always required confirmation to whatever he said. Clyde put up with him because the man did exactly what he was told, no questions asked. Sure to have one, Clyde answered, grabbing his own canvas sack. He and his men, as well as the other departing train passengers, walked down the aisle to the exit. This place doesn't look like they know what whiskey is, Frank commented, gazing around from the platform. This is worse than Montana, and I thought that place was primitive. But no one will think to look for us here, Clyde said, watching as the porter tossed bags and satchels out of the train and grabbing his own. The law thinks we went to Oregon. I think our prospects might have been better there. Not many folks here for us to swindle. Clyde gave Frank a warning look. Shut up, will you? Frank eyed the people around them, well within listening distance, then nodded. Leading the way toward the main street of Miners Creek, Clyde observed the bank, the town hall, the hotel which appeared promising as a place to stay, a general store, livery stable, a land assayer's office and at last, the saloon. Walking to the hotel first, Clyde observed the people walking along the street, or riding on horseback or in wagons. Inwardly, he suspected that Frank was right, there were not many innocents here to prey upon, as those he saw appeared to be farmers and ranchers. But he did not tell his men his real reason for coming. Obtaining rooms, Clyde and his gang put their luggage inside on the beds, then gathered downstairs to head over to the saloon for a few drinks, and maybe a card game or 2. He saw the town sheriff strolling down the street, a star on his shirt and a very big gun on his hip. Clyde himself carried a gun but preferred not to display it. The lawman paid them no heed, although Sylvester grew agitated at the sight of him. Ignore him, Clyde ordered. You want to draw attention to us? Sylvester nodded, then instantly shook his head. No, Clyde. Frank rolled his eyes while Fred scowled. Idiot, he muttered. Selecting a table farthest from the door, Clyde sat down, his gang following suit. A bar girl approached with a professional smile and took his order for whiskey all around. Taking stock of the other patrons, he found much of the same in here as he did on the street. A few cowboys at the bar drinking beer, 2 businessmen at a table talking in low tones over whiskey, and what appeared to be a few ranchers meeting to discuss cattle. The girl brought their drinks, then departed to pay a call on the ranchers. Clyde found his whiskey drinkable and of a decent brand. He relaxed in his chair. It felt good to be off the train at last. He suspected he would sleep well that night. So, what are we going to do here, Clyde? Frank asked. Lay low. Stay here for a month, then move on. Maybe go to Denver. Fred nodded. Lots of good prospects in Denver. I don't understand why we came here though. Because I heard a few things about this place and have no plans to share my good fortune with you fools. I told you, we need to just lay low for a spell, Clyde answered, growing annoyed. In case the authorities in a big town like Denver are keeping an eye out for us. I think a month in this place will drive me crazy, Frank muttered, tossing the last of his whiskey down his throat. Absolutely nothing to do here. Maybe we should rob the bank before we go, Sylvester said brightly. Clyde, can we rob the bank? Clyde considered it. Maybe. If we do, Frank, you can spend your time planning it. At least that's something to do, Frank replied, signaling the bar girl for a refill. I'm for it. Fred, tomorrow, you find us some decent horses, Clyde said after she had filled their glasses from the bottle and returned to the bar. Make good bargains. You know how I hate to spend money. I expect we can't just steal Fred added, nodding. Not if we're going to stick around a while. Exactly. Maybe the livery has some decent mounts. If not, get a recommendation for one of these sodbusters who may have horses to sell. All right. Both Clyde's stomach and his pocket watch informed him it was time for dinner. He paid their tab, wincing as he did so, then ambled through the bat-wing doors to return to the hotel. The whiskey settled nicely into his stomach, and he wondered if the saloon livened up after darkness fell. Maybe that would be when he and his companions could find a good card game. Dinner at the hotel was better than he expected. He ate the hot roast beef and gravy, potatoes, cornbread and buttered beans with enthusiasm, grateful that this backwater town had a few decent amenities at least. Fortunately, his companions kept their mouths shut, and Sylvester kept his eyes on his plate rather than on the sheriff who dined at a nearby table. Darkness had fallen by the time they walked back to the saloon, and, like Montana, the air cooled considerably once the sun went down. Clyde definitely wanted out of here before winter struck. The snows this close to the mountains might make leaving Miners Creek difficult on horseback. That is, if they decided to rob the bank after all. The saloon had indeed livened up by the time he and his companions returned, and Clyde soon found a card game with 3 cowboys. Frank and Fred found another, while Sylvester merely sat nearby and watched. He had never learned to play poker and never wanted to. Clyde had learned how to cheat at cards at an early age, and soon recouped what he had spent on their travel from Montana. The cowboys muttered sourly, finished their beers and departed, leaving a well-satisfied Clyde to count their money and put it in his pocket. You are a very good card player, Clyde, Sylvester said as he followed his boss out the door. How did you get to be so good? Practice. Chapter 6. As he had thought he might, Clyde slept well that night, and was up and eating breakfast before his men came down the stairs. Hoping the assayer's office was open early, he left the hotel and ambled down the street in the chill morning air. Few people were out at that hour, yet a few farmers traveled in on their buckboard wagons, no doubt having left their farms well before dawn. Clyde shuddered to think of the hours these farmers and ranchers kept, and preferred stealing someone else's hard-earned money than working to make his own. The assayer was indeed in as he entered, taking off his bowler hat. The little man with spectacles on his nose glanced up and asked, "Help you?" "I hope so," Clyde answered, offering the man a polite smile and his hand to shake. "I want to make inquiries about a plot of land." "Which plot would that be?" Taking out the folded map his companions had no idea existed, Clyde sat in a chair and pointed out the marked-off square. "That one." The assayer peered down at it through his spectacles, then consulted a book similar to a ledger he pulled from the shelf behind him. Opening it, he compared the book to Clyde's map, muttering under his breath and annoying Clyde to no end. "Ah, here it is," he said at last. "That piece of land you are inquiring about is owned by the Reilly Ranch." Disappointed, but not truly surprised, Clyde said, "I see. Are they willing to perhaps sell their property?" The assayer returned his book to the shelf and Clyde's map to him. "I have no idea, sir." "How do I find this ranch, then?" "Take the main street in town west a few miles," the little man said. "I believe there is a lane that leads to it. It is partly in the mountains and the foothills." Clyde rose and offered his hand again. "Much obliged." Tucking the map back in his coat pocket, Clyde wandered back to the hotel, wondering who in town might give him information on the Reilly Ranch. These folks were always in one another's business and knew things about each other no stranger ever would. However, he found Fred on his way to the livery stable and caught up to him. "Where have you been?" Fred asked, curious. "I thought you'd be at breakfast." "I ate earlier," Clyde answered, stepping up to amble at his side. Just went out to get familiar with this place. Are Frank and Sylvester still sleeping? Yeah, I guess. I haven't seen them yet today. Lazy so-and-sos. The owner of the livery stable was feeding his stock when they arrived, his barn almost full. As Fred knew horses best and could drive a hard bargain when buying or selling them, Clyde wandered up and down the aisle, looking at the horses as Fred and the owner talked. He watched as they went into stalls to talk legs and necks, examining teeth and eyes, discussing each animal's merits and faults. Content to wait, he went back outside to the warm sunshine and gazed up at the clear blue sky. Frank and Sylvester emerged from the hotel and spotted him on the sidewalk. They headed toward him, their open coats blowing back in the light wind off the mountains. Frank glanced into the interior of the barn, his brow raised. This fellow have horses to sell? Seems so. Fred is bargaining now. It took an hour, but Fred emerged from the shadows with a grin on his round face. $15 each, and that includes saddle and bridles. Though he hated to pass over that much money, Clyde cheered himself when he remembered the cowboys paid for half of that. Counting the bills into the hand of the livery stable's owner, he half listened to the chatter as the other three saddled their new mounts. Sylvester said over and over how much he liked the back gelding he picked out of the four Clyde just bought. Clyde himself couldn't care less what color horse he was given. All he wanted was a solid mount that would neither buck him off nor die on him the moment he needed it most. Out in the street, he mounted the red roan and led his small band toward the west end of town. Where are we going? Frank asked. No place special, Clyde said. I just want to get out and explore this place. You don't have to come along if you don't want to. In the end, they decided to ride with him, having nothing else to do except drink whiskey. Outside of town, the aspens started to change from green to gold, clusters of gold amid the pines and evergreen trees. Clyde rode, half listening to his men talk about women and the money they had earned in Montana. Though they had split the small fortune among them, Clyde had agreed to pay for most of their expenditures. If he chose to sell the horses, then he'd pocket the money received from their sale, even if he made a profit. Trotting down the road, he found himself enjoying the ride out of town, and pondered ways to head out alone when he went to seek the Reilly ranch. He refused to share the gold he planned to take from the creek that crossed the ranch property. Though he did not want the entire ranch, what the hell do I want with a ranch? He expected that he would have to buy it, extract the gold from the creek, then sell it again. Hopefully, at a tidy profit. Clyde chuckled to himself at the thought of the riches he would have, earning them right under the noses of Frank, Fred, and Sylvester. While they sat in the saloon eyeing the barmaid and drinking whiskey, he would pan for his gold, hide the proceeds in his room, then sell it when they reached Denver. He knew they trusted him and would never question his doings if he made a good excuse as to his absences. He finally saw it. The narrow lane, about as wide as a buckboard wagon, leading up into the mountains. The road continued west, probably going only as far as the next town, whatever that was. Reining in, he turned to the men. I expect it's time to head back. I don't want to head into the hills. We might run into Injuns, Clyde, Sylvester agreed. Think there might be Injuns up yonder? Most likely, Clyde answered, turning his roan. I thought all the Indians were run out of here, Frank commented, glancing around as he turned his horse. I don't believe they all were, Clyde said. That notion disturbed him. What if he ran into a tribe of Indian warriors while he was panning for his gold? Even in Montana, not all the Indians had been driven out. Many still fought bloody engagements to protect their lands and hunting territories. For the first time, he considered bringing the others in on his plan. He might need their guns and watchful eyes. Chapter 7. By the fourth day since his arrival at the ranch, Shield's lesser wounds were closing, his injuries remaining free of infection. He was in considerable pain, but he slept without the use of laudanum. Though he felt helpless, at the mercy of this white woman, he also discovered himself strangely attracted to her. Rebecca's kindness toward him at first baffled him, then he came to recognize it as simply her way. Her sons had also taken to visiting with him when they were not too busy working the ranch. He asked them no personal questions, but freely spoke to them about his life in the tribe. But it was the younger of the two, Noah, who finally told him what had happened to their father. He got sick, Noah told him, sitting in the chair Rebecca always sat in to treat his wounds. Really sick. No one could help him, not Ma, not the doctor. Your father died? Noah nodded. It's been about a year now. Ma doesn't cry as much as she used to, but it has been hard for her. You and your brother run this ranch? Yeah. We don't mind the work, as it means we get to keep the place. But Ma says that if we can't keep it running, she will have to sell. Your mother is a courageous woman, Shields said, meaning it. He knew the difficulties a woman faced without a man to protect her and provide for her. Her sons worked from dawn to dusk, then helped her around the house in the evenings. Shield had heard them in the kitchen, all talking as they fixed supper when his door had been left open. Yeah, I think she has a lot of guts, too, Noah replied. She works all day feeding the pigs, the chickens, milking the cows, planting and harvesting the garden. Things like that. You are fortunate to have such a mother. What's your ma like, Shield? Shield tensed at the question. While he was learning to trust the Reilly family, he had no desire to tell them of his birth. How his mother, a Cheyenne woman, was beaten and raped by white men. She conceived and decided not to abandon her child, but raised him with the love and guidance she might have given a child conceived in love. Raised a Cheyenne, he knew from early childhood that he was different. He was half white, half his blood came from the hated and vicious race that plagued his own. Thus, he had grown to hate whites, despise the part of him that came from them. He harbored a burning desire to slay all white men and women. Of course, he could not. Should he start killing white people, they would come with their soldiers and wipe out the remains of his tribe and his race. Shield. Noah's young voice brought him back to the present. She is strong like your mother, he responded. Kind to others, much like your mother is kind to me. Yeah, she is always good like that, Noah told him, nodding. She calls it being Christian, but I know lots of people who go to church but do bad things to people. Once, Ma nursed a sick old lady until she died. No one else in town would help her. But Ma did. Shield shifted on the bed until he got more comfortable, watching Noah's face carefully. So these Christians, as you say, pretend to be good, but they are not. Exactly. They go to church and pretend to be good people, but some of those folks were the ones who refused to help the old lady. Why would they not help her? Noah shrugged. My pa told me that she used to be a lady of the night, whatever that is. They would turn their backs on her, refuse to talk to her in the street. But Ma said what a person does in their past, and repents of, should not matter. So, she helped the lady. Are most white people like these bad Christians? Shield asked. Noah frowned. No, I don't think so. I mean, there's good and bad everywhere. You have good people and bad people, and maybe in between. I don't know. Aren't there bad Cheyenne in your tribe? Shield nodded. Yes. Some Cheyenne who do not care for their wives or their children. Some who drink the white man's whiskey and cause trouble. I guess that means no matter where you come from, there are going to be good and bad folks. Right? Shield smiled slightly. I guess you might be right about that, Noah. After the boy had gone, Shield sat and pondered what he had heard. He had grown up believing all white people, and their Christian religion, were evil, were liars, and were murderers. When the dogs attacked him and he saw the boys, he immediately thought they came to kill him. Instead, they saved his life. Why? He realized he was a burden to them. Rebecca took time away from her work running this place without a husband, to care for him. She did it with a smile, without complaint, and without expecting anything in return. Why? He would have left a white man to be torn apart by the dogs. Did that make him the evil one? He had not found any answers when Rebecca arrived later with his dinner. He studied her, wondering what was going on behind those green eyes. She found him watching her and smiled at him quizzically. What? Noah told me about your husband. Rebecca looked away, wrapping his throat with a fresh bandage. Yes, well, not much to say, really. Tim died, and we're struggling without him. I am sorry. Rebecca stared out the small window into the twilight. I was very fortunate to find such a wonderful man. You see, I was a mail-order bride. What does that mean? There is an agency that helps men find women in different parts of the country. Rebecca continued wrapping his wounds with fresh bandages. Tim was building this ranch, but there were no women for the men out here to marry and raise a family with. So, he and I communicated through letters. I see. Shields said, frowning. That would mean you married a complete stranger. I did. Rebecca paused again, gazing into his eyes. But Tim was everything I could have dreamed of in a husband, handsome, loving, kind in every way. We worked our fingers to the bone building this ranch. Then you must not sell it. Rebecca chuckled. Noah told you that, too. Yes. I'll admit I don't want to, she said, resuming her care. But I also cannot see my boys working themselves to death. We have little money, and some things we just cannot get repaired. We go without sometimes. Winter is coming, and you know the winters are harsh up here. I do know. My people also suffer the hardships. I want my boys to marry someday, raise their own children. I do not want to see them with nothing to show for what they do. Shield touched her fingers with his own. They are willing to sacrifice for you to keep this ranch. You should let them make that choice. Rebecca gazed down at his hand touching hers. You give me courage, Shield, she whispered. Thank you. I should thank you, he replied, offering a tiny grin. You are teaching me much about white people. She laughed. Well, that's good then. I hope. I am sorry I am such a burden. Rebecca stopped laughing, eyeing him with no little confusion. I do not think you are a burden. I like you, Shield. He only looked at her. He liked her, too. As though just realizing he was still touching her, she moved her hand, blushing faintly. Shield liked seeing her face when it turned pink. I will bring you your dinner, Shield, she said, rising. Roast chicken tonight. I have been smelling it. Turning toward the door, Rebecca suddenly turned back. I know it will hurt you, Shield, but tomorrow you need to try walking. Your leg will turn to mush if you do not start using the muscles. He smiled. I will start walking tomorrow. Chapter 8. After breakfast, Shield did as he had promised. Rebecca watched, biting her lower lip, as he swung his legs out of bed in preparation for standing. He balanced precariously on his less injured right leg, gingerly putting weight on his badly injured left. She saw sweat break out on his brow, but he clenched his jaw and limped forward 2 steps. Rebecca clapped her hands, grinning. That is terrific, Shield. How about another 2 steps? He panted lightly, but she recognized the glimmer of humor sparking in his deep brown eyes. What do I get for 2 more steps? He asked. A piece of cake. I want something different. Rebecca blushed at the look in his eyes and felt a tickle of delight course down into her belly. She knew beyond all good sense that she liked Shield more than a little, and found him intriguing, exceptionally good-looking. She enjoyed his company. She found excuses to spend time in his room, checking his wounds, dabbing iodine on them, looking at the way his muscles moved under his coppery skin. Those muscles rippled now as he hobbled closer to her, standing over her and gazing down into her eyes. Oh, how she liked his closeness, relished how he made her feel, the way Tim made her feel when they were first married. Shield, she whispered. His lips closed over hers, sweet, soft, gentle, yet utterly masculine. She opened hers under the light pressure, feeling his fingers trace their way down her cheek. She craved to wrap her arms around his neck, to lean into him, feel his hands sweep up her back. Then, like a dash of cold water, she realized she was in a room alone, kissing a half-naked man she was not married to. Breaking away, Rebecca felt her cheeks flame hotter even as Shield smiled. "For that, you walk all the way to the door," she said, avoiding his amused eyes. Stepping aside to give him room, she watched as he put more weight on his bad leg and reached the door. "Why don't you come out and sit in the living room?" she asked. "You're doing better than I expected." Shield nodded and limped his way down the short hallway. He peered into the kitchen on his right, the bedrooms on his left, then hobbled on down to finally collapse on an armchair. "How was that?" he asked, grinning. "Would you like some tea?" "Yes, thanks." However, before she reached the kitchen, a knock sounded at the front door. She met Shield's eyes, surprised, as they received very few visitors out here. Striding toward the door, she glanced through the wide window that looked out over the road and the front yard, seeing an unfamiliar roan horse tied to the railing. Opening the door, Rebecca found herself gazing at a man of middle years, wearing a bowler hat, which he removed immediately. He was not very tall, with a stocky build, light gray eyes and thin nearly white hair. "Good day, madam," he said. "Forgive the unannounced visit. My name is Clyde Foster." "What can I do for you, Mr. Foster?" Rebecca instinctively mistrusted him. His smile seemed oily, too sure of himself, and his eyes lingered on her more than was socially acceptable. The small hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, and she almost slammed the door in his face. "I am interested in buying property in the area," he said with a short bow. "I heard in town that you recently buried your husband. I am profoundly sorry for your loss. Why does that bring you to my door?" "Why, I thought perhaps you wished to sell this fine piece of land. I am willing to pay top dollar for it." He pulled a piece of paper from his inner pocket. "I have taken the liberty of drawing up a contract, Mrs. Reilly," he said, handing it to her. "You are awfully sure of yourself, Mr. Foster," she said, growing angry, her back stiff. "You seem to think you can walk right in here, and I will give you what you want?" "No," he smiled thinly. "I think I can walk up here and make you an offer. Surely you cannot run this ranch with just 2 boys to raise. Surely, you must think I am a helpless widow." Rebecca smiled, wondering how he knew all about her boys. "You will find that to be a very big mistake, Mr. Foster." His smile faltered. "I am making a good offer at fair market price, Mrs. Reilly. I do not believe I am willing to sell without a few more offers on the table." "Who else would want to buy this place except me?" he demanded, his face suffused with anger. Rebecca looked him up and down. "You don't look like a rancher to me." He straightened his coat. "I expect an answer by the end of the week, Mrs. Reilly. I will return." "It's your time to waste, Mr. Foster." Watching him mount his horse, Rebecca watched him rein the roan around, and lash the reins across the horse's rump, forcing it into a dead run. He vanished into a cloud of dust, leaving her to bite her lip with worry. That was not the way one offered to buy property in her estimation. Something about the entire thing seemed very peculiar. Closing the door, she found Shield on his feet, gazing out the window at the dust that still lingered in the still air. "You heard everything?" He nodded, his face a mask of anger. "You cannot trust him, Rebecca," he said, his tone fierce. "As a matter of fact, I don't," she replied, eyeing him closely. "You seem like you know him." "I do." Shield finally sat back down, rubbing his leg. "He cheated my people. He and his white friends took land from us several years ago, promising to pay. They never did. When we tried to get moved back, his thugs attacked us, killed several warriors. I have wanted to punish him, and them, but our chief will not permit it. We cannot risk the soldiers attacking our village." Rebecca sighed. "That matches what my gut told me. Not to trust him. He is one bad white man." "Then I expect he will try to do to me what he did to your people," Rebecca said, rubbing her arms, feeling the chill. "Take my ranch without paying. But you must not sell. Not to him, not to anyone." That is what my boys tell me. Chapter 9. Furious with the audacity of that woman to throw his offer in his face, Clyde galloped the entire way to town, cursing under his breath. How dare she, he muttered, lashing his horse with his reins. No woman has any business owning land. This was a difficulty he had not foreseen. The people he spoke with in Miners Creek told him the Reilly ranch suffered financially. A widow with young boys to raise should have jumped at his offer. Instead, she looked at him as though he, Clyde Foster, was something nasty she just scraped off her shoe. No one looked at Clyde Foster that way. No one. He pondered sneaking onto her land without her knowledge and taking the gold from the creek. Yet, the penalties for that were far too high for him to risk. He must buy that land, remove the gold, then sell it again. After all, it was prime land, and he could sell it again at a profit. Yet, how could he get the Reilly woman to leave? He chuckled to himself, his fury vanishing. How about I get her off that land without buying it? If he could force her out, then he could afford to bring Frank, Fred, and Sylvester into the plan and still make himself very rich. Steal her cattle, her horses, set fire to her barn, she would beg him to take it just so he will leave her alone. She would sign anything, even the deed to her property, over to him, if it meant sparing the lives of her boys. Clyde had few qualms about dirtying his hands with murder. He had done it before. However, that happened with another gang years earlier, and he pondered whether Frank and Fred had the belly for it. Sylvester would do anything he told him to do. But the others, well, they were more independent, and might balk at killing a woman and her 2 children. If they do, Clyde told himself happily, then I'll kill them, too, and I won't be forced to split my gold up with them. He laughed aloud, making his roan's ears swivel around to listen. Maybe I'll kill them anyway. Pan the gold from the creek, then shoot them all. Dead men have no need for gold. Feeling better about this whole situation, Clyde trotted through town to the livery stable. He turned the horse over to the owner to care for, then strode quickly down the street to the saloon. Piano music leaked out from its doors and into the street as he approached it, with several saddled horses tied out front. Ambling through the bat-wing doors, he blinked as his eyes adjusted to the gloom of the interior after the bright sunlight outside. He found Frank, Fred, and Sylvester seated at a table, Frank and Fred playing cards while Sylvester watched. Beer in tall glasses sat in front of them, and they glanced up as he took the 4th chair to sit in. The place was nearly full to capacity, and then Clyde remembered that this was late on a Saturday afternoon. Cowboys came in from ranches all over after their work week was finished to drink, play cards, or look for a fight. Where you been, Clyde? Frank asked, dealing out another card to Fred. Making some plans. Fred eyed him curiously. The bank? Better than the bank, he said, gazing around. The saloon was noisy, and it was not likely anyone could overhear what they said to one another. Still, he felt cautious about discussing his scheme with them in such a public place. We are going to run a widow off her land. What for? Frank asked, examining his cards. It's not like we want to settle here. We can't pick the land up and take it with us. But we can take the gold off the land. That got Frank's attention. He tossed his cards into the middle of the table and leaned toward Clyde. How do you know this widow's land has gold on it? I asked a few questions around town, Clyde said, without any compunction at all about lying to his friends. I heard things. So that's where you been, right, Clyde? Sylvester asked, eager, also leaning forward. You been checking it all out, right? That's right. Clyde observed Frank's eyes narrow, and Fred watched him closely. These two were not nearly as dumb as Sylvester and were experienced swindlers. They could smell a lie just as easily as he could. Yet, they could not prove he was lying. So we run the widow off, Frank said slowly, meeting his eyes, studying him, take her land, and pan the gold? Is that right? Once she signs the property deed over to me, Clyde added, nodding. Then I sell it and add to our take. If everyone in town knows about gold on her land, Fred asked, Why are they not buying it and mining for it? I never said everyone knew, Clyde said, impatient. Only a few. And maybe they are planning to, but we will beat them to it. That would mean spending the winter here, Frank said, thoughtfully. Once we have her property, we'll live in her house. Sounds too easy, Fred commented. Frank still watched him, no doubt sensing what Clyde did not say. When do we start? Tomorrow. We ride up there and check things out. See the lay of the land, where her cattle are, maybe cut some fence. At last, Frank nodded, taking his penetrating eyes off Clyde and back to the card game. Your deal. Chapter 10. Though still weak and in pain, Shield insisted on helping Rebecca and the boys out with some of the work at the house. Noah and David returned from a successful hunt with a big bull elk and hung it in the barn for skinning and cutting the meat. Able to stand for longer periods of time, Shield skinned it, set the hide aside for curing, then started to dress it out. Rebecca started a fire with green hardwood in the smokehouse and hung the meat inside it as Shield cut the elk up. Without the chore of having to do that themselves, Noah and David rode out to check on the cattle in the meadows. Shield might not know much about raising cattle, he did know how to cure hides and preserve food. More tired than he liked to admit, Shield limped back to the house to wash and perhaps sit for a while. Rebecca closed the smokehouse door and followed him into the house. Thank you, she said as he cleaned his hands at the sink. That helped us out enormously. But you shouldn't overdo it yet. Shield nodded with a small grin. It did wear me out, I confess. I will rest a while, then start on the hide. He sat down at the kitchen table, finding it strange to be wearing cloth clothing rather than the buckskin he had worn all his life. Rebecca clad him in some of her husband's clothes, sewing them to make them fit him. Slowly coming to terms with white people and the part of him that shared their blood, Shield found an inner calm deep within himself that had never been there before. Rebecca sat down at the table with him, her expression oddly strained. You are almost well enough to ride a horse, she said, her eyes shunted to the side. I suppose then you will return to your people. He fingered the stitches still in his neck. Rebecca planned to remove them in another day or two, as she said they were about ready to come out. While he knew he should return home, part of him did not want to. He liked Rebecca more than a little and found acceptance with her sons. Torn, he had no clear idea what he should do. He was a stranger to them, just as she would be a stranger amid his Cheyenne. But could those conflicts be resolved with love and acceptance? I will go if you wish me to, he finally said. Though I do not want to. Her green eyes fastened in him, shining. You want to stay? I like you, Rebecca, he said, feeling warmth spread through him at the hope in her countenance. More than some. I do not know where this leads. I do know I would stay here for a while longer. I'm glad to hear that, she said, her lips trembling as she smiled. I like you, too, Shield. More than a lot. Maybe in time, we can see where this might go. I know David and Noah want you to stay. They look up to you. They are good boys, he admitted. Very brave. Like warriors. Don't tell them that, she chuckled. They might start thinking they are invincible and do things they shouldn't. I believe you underestimate them, Rebecca. They are smart and understand the perils of living in these mountains. She nodded, then stood up. How about lunch? Let's eat, and then you rest. I have to get back to the garden and get the vegetables in. We could have a hard frost any day now. Hours later, Shield staked the elk hideout where it would dry as he worked to cure it, making it soft and pliable. He sat carefully on the ground, occasionally glancing up to see Rebecca in the huge garden, her face concealed by the bonnet on her head. In his preconceptions about white women, he had always thought them to be soft, too soft to work the way Indian women did. He liked Rebecca even more for the fearless way she tackled the work that needed to be done for her family's survival. Hoof beats at a gallop forced him painfully to his feet, and brought Rebecca running from the garden. Meeting in the yard, they both stared as David and Noah cantered their horses toward them. Something is wrong, she said. They do not appear to be harmed, Shield said, watching them draw closer. David reined in front of them. Someone cut our fence, Ma, he said, his face dark with anger. We spent all day rounding up the cattle and fixing the fence. Who would cut our fences? Rebecca asked, bewildered. All our neighbors are friendly with us. Clyde Foster. It took Shield only seconds to jump to that conclusion, and he was certain he was not wrong. As Rebecca glanced up at him, he nodded grimly. He is treacherous and relentless. He will make trouble for you until you sell your land to him. Don't do it, Ma, David said, jumping down from his horse. You can't sell this ranch, especially to someone who is trying to force us out. We can fight back. But how? She asked, turning from Shield to David. We have 500 acres to protect. If he runs our cattle off, David said firmly, we will bring them back. Noah and me will do whatever it takes to keep us on this place. Ma, don't give in to him. Shield gazed out over the mountains, at the pine and evergreen, the aspens turning gold. He was part of this land, heard it speak to him, felt it deep in his bones. His people walked here long before the white men came. Yet, was he not also a white man? Torn between two worlds, he longed to return to his people, to the world he knew. Yet, could he stay with Rebecca, Noah and David, and perhaps become a part of their world? Not knowing the answers to those questions, he did know he could not abandon them to fight this battle alone. They saved his life. Shield owed them, and a Cheyenne always paid his debts. He liked them, perhaps even loved them. No, he could not leave, not yet. Not until Rebecca and her ranch was safe. If you are willing to fight to keep what is yours, Rebecca, he said, turning his face to her. I will fight at your side. Yay! Noah yelled from atop his horse. I knew you would stay, Shield, I just knew it. Rebecca stared at Shield. You would do that? For us? Yes. You don't owe us anything, Shield, she said, her hands on her hips. Do not stay because you feel obligated. He grinned. I am obligated. And not just for you saving my life. Rebecca merely shook her head. All right. She gazed around at her sons. We will stay. I will not sell this place. David's grin matched the sun for brightness. With Shield here to protect you, Noah and I can keep a better eye on the cattle. We'll ride out every day, and if they cut the fence again, we'll fix it. Right, Noah chimed in. Then get your horses cared for, Rebecca replied. And start chores. I'm going in to start supper. Shield limped back to the elk hide to complete his work on it for the day. It would require more labor on his part before it was usable, but it also needed to dry. As he worked, he wondered how he could fight for Rebecca and her sons when he could barely walk. Though his wounds were healing at a rapid pace, he knew it would be at least another week before he could even consider riding a horse. Despite the looming threat of Foster's machinations, dinner that evening was cheerful. Noah and David were enthusiastic about their role in protecting the ranch their father built. Shield met Rebecca's eyes over the table, understanding without words that something grew between them, an attraction that neither of them could deny. He offered her a tiny smile, and received one in return, his heart warming to the expression in her eyes. He knew then he was falling in love with her. Chapter 11. Ma, Noah gasped, reining in his lathered mount to a sharp, sliding halt. The fence was cut again. This time someone stole cattle. Rebecca wanted to curse. In the days following the first time their fence had been cut, nothing at all happened. She had begun to believe that perhaps Clyde Foster was not actually involved, and that the incident had been but a prank. How many are gone? She asked, feeling her anger rise. We think 15, Noah answered. David is following the tracks now, but he thinks they are heading east toward Sand River. And the cattle market there. Shield limped toward her, his strength returning and his walking ability coming back at a rapid pace. She had removed all his stitches to find his flesh healing, and only the deep wound in his thigh gave him any real problems. He glanced askance at her. Can we catch them before they get there? He asked. Rebecca glanced at the sun. Mid-afternoon. If they rode hard, they might catch up, at least get to the town of Sand River in time to stop the sale. But that meant risking Shield's newfound healing, and potentially burst his still raw bites and cuts open again. That she could not risk. Not for a few head of cattle. No, she said, deciding, blowing out a gust of breath in frustration. Noah, get your brother back here. Tomorrow, move the vulnerable cattle to the higher elevations, into the mountains and close the fence off. These maggots will find it harder to steal them from up there. The rest should be safe enough where they are, as they are more difficult to get to. But there isn't much grazing up there, Ma, Noah said, anxious. Then they'll be a little hungry, she snapped. We can bring them back down once we get this resolved. Somehow. Wheeling his horse, Noah took off at a gallop back the way he had come. She met Shield's dark eyes, almost as angry as her own. Looks like the battle has begun, she said, her tone dry. Yes, it has. Stepping closer to him, Rebecca took his hand in hers. Are you sure you want to be involved? This could get ugly. He squeezed her hand. It got ugly the moment that evil man stood on your porch. I will not desert you, Rebecca. She smiled. Somehow thank you sounds so inadequate. In gazing into his eyes, seeing his faint and fearless grin, she felt a bond form with Shield, something that went beyond their attraction for each other, far more than her care of him. Love stirred in her heart, a powerful emotion she thought she would never feel again. She had loved Timothy with all her heart and soul and thought it over when she buried him. Now, as though by magic, her heart had healed along with Shield's wounds, and that gave her the freedom to love again. Hoof beats coming from the road spun them both around. Rebecca saw the roan horse, the white hair under the bowler hat. It's him, she gasped. How dare he? I will get rid of him, Shield snarled, stepping forward. Rebecca caught his arm. No. I don't want him to see you, not yet. As long as he thinks I'm an unprotected widow, he might underestimate us. She strode quickly to the house, Shield at her side, grinning down at her. You are thinking like a warrior. Am I? Listen, just stay in the house, out of sight. I will send him on his way. Entering the house by the back door, Rebecca and Shield watched through the window as Clyde Foster trotted the roan toward them, gazing around at the deserted front yard as he did so. He dismounted at the veranda as he had done before, tying his reins to the post. Rebecca swung the door wide and stepped out before he climbed the steps. Get off my property. Clyde took his hat from his head, his oily smirk still in place. Why, madam, I have come to discuss the terms of you selling your ranch to me. I have no intention of selling anything to you. Now get out of here before I fetch my rifle. The smirk vanished. His eyes narrowed. Now that is downright inhospitable, Mrs. Reilly. I came to discuss this matter with you in a civilized fashion. You are not going to frighten me or run me out of my home, Mr. Foster, she gritted, her fury growing, tempted to go in and get her rifle as she threatened. I know it was you who stole my cattle. He spread his arms wide. How can I have stolen your cows when I am right here? Rebecca's eyes narrowed. That is itself is an admission, Foster, she snapped. Because you know they were taken today. Perhaps it's high time I went to the sheriff about your shenanigans. Clyde strolled up the steps toward her, his expression tight, his eyes intent upon her. I am sure, Mrs. Reilly, that you wouldn't want anything bad to happen to those precious sons of yours. Would you? All alone out there, no protection against dangerous Indians or outlaws. How dare you threaten me? Or my sons? I am not making any threats, dear lady, he replied, grinning, his eyes traveling up and down her body as he stepped close to her. I am merely pointing out the dangers of young boys riding out there in the wilderness. Anything could happen, you know. Standing her ground, refusing to show her rising fear for the safety of David and Noah, Rebecca faced him squarely. The only danger they are in is from you, she ground out slowly. Now I told you before, get off my property before I fetch my gun. Clyde seized her by the arm, raising his fist. You won't be fetching any damn gun. He broke off suddenly as Rebecca heard Shield step onto the veranda behind her. Clyde's jaw dropped, his eyes widened in shock, as he lowered his fist and released her arm. Not daring to look away from Clyde, Rebecca saw Shield step up beside her, a rifle in his hands, pointed unwaveringly at Clyde. I believe the lady told you to leave, Shield said, his voice low, deadly. I would listen to her. I know you. Clyde backed away, all but stumbling as he tried to go down the steps without turning his back on Shield. You're that Indian. That's right. You stole our land, set your men to killing my people. Right now I have very little reason to not kill you, except that Mrs. Reilly told me not to. Shield cocked the hammer back. But right now, I am really tempted to ignore her wishes, and take a little vengeance for myself. You wouldn't dare. You would hang for killing me. Rebecca crossed her arms over her chest. Really? Who would know? I should let him shoot you dead, then dump your corpse for the crows to feast on. No evidence that you had ever been here. Sweat dripped down from Clyde's face as he scrambled into his saddle. His lips twisted into a feral snarl as he glared at the two of them. You haven't heard the last of this, he gritted. I will have your land if I have to kill you, your boys, and that rotten Indian. Sawing? Savagely on his reins, Clyde wheeled the roan around and lashed it with the reins. Watching him gallop away, Rebecca's fears did not diminish. He is going to come back with everything he has, she said, turning to sit down on a chair. Am I doing the right thing to risk all our lives for a plot of land? Shield set the rifle down, leaning it against the porch railing, and looked out over the ranch yard, barn, the horses in the corral. My people have been fighting for their right to live where they wish for over 50 years. The white men keep coming, killing us, taking everything we have. We have not given up. We will keep on fighting. He finally met her eyes. So should you. Your people have suffered much at the hands of mine, she said wearily. Your people, my people, Shield said, his thumbs hooked into his belt. They are one and the same. Rebecca gazed up at him, confused. What do you mean? I am half white, half Cheyenne, he said, squinting as he gazed out over the ranch again. My mother was raped by a white man. I am the result. I have hated whites all my life, wanting to eradicate them from our land forever. I hated myself for being part of what has hurt my mother, my tribe for so long. But how can I hate any longer? You have shown me what a kind and loving heart can do against such hatred. Her voice faint, Rebecca said, I am so sorry, Shield. His confession stunned her. Rebecca glanced away from him. Your mother must have been a very strong woman to endure that, to still find it within her to raise you with love. Yes, she is. Like you, she chose love over hate. He raised a faint grin. I suppose I should have learned from her a long time ago. I am glad you were here, Shield, Rebecca said, looking her hands in her lap. I never expected Foster to get violent. You saved me. Men like him are evil, Rebecca, Shield replied. And cowardly. He thought you were alone, vulnerable, and that he could harm you without a care. Like those dogs that attacked me, they run in packs, just as Foster does. If his gang was with him, things might not have turned out so well. Standing, Rebecca walked to stand at his side. When he comes back, he will not be alone, will he? No. He will not be alone. Chapter 12. Pitching his voice low, Clyde's fury still rang through. That Reilly woman has made a little friend, he snarled, gazing around at the busy hotel dining room. Though they sat at a table furthest from the kitchen and there was an empty table between them and the closest ears, his voice lowered, more furtive-like. A rotten Indian. Frank peered at him over his mug of beer. Maybe we should find easier pickings somewhere else. No. Clyde glared at him. We stay in this. I want that land. I want that gold. If you can't stomach fighting an Indian and a woman, you can clear on out now. I'll do it without you. We got over $200 today, Clyde, Sylvester said, cheerful. Selling them cows. Maybe we can steal more cows, huh, Clyde? Can we? Maybe. Clyde still glared at Frank. Are you in this? Frank set his beer down, returning Clyde's fury with a calm that incensed Clyde even further. You're talking killing, aren't you? Kill the widow, the Indian, and the kids. Is that what you're asking us to do? Yes. Once we kill the boys, Widow Reilly will cave in immediately, and sign over the deed to her house to me. To you. So we get to risk hanging by killing a pair of boys so you can get the land and all its gold as well as its profits. Exactly. Then we kill the Indian, you won't hang for that, and leave that widow as helpless as a baby. You want us to kill boys? Fred asked, incredulous. Hey, I didn't sign on to kill anybody, much less kids. You will do what I say, Fred, Clyde snarled in an undertone. Or you will leave now and get nothing. Maybe we should leave, Fred, Frank stated still with that unnerving calm. Let Clyde and Sylvester hang for the murder of 2 boys. Me hang? Sylvester stared, gaping. What did I do? Clyde, what did I do? Shut up. He pointed his finger at Frank. If you try to go, I will tell the sheriff who you are. You won't go anywhere on my horses and will spend the rest of your days in prison. Frank and Fred glanced at one another. What's to stop us from fingering you, Clyde? Frank asked. You'll go to prison, too. Clyde sneered. Because I'll be long gone before anyone believes you. Me and Sylvester will be in Wyoming territory before the law can start looking. Then we will come back and pan our riches once they do stop. Clyde knew he had them when Frank shrugged and glanced at Fred. All right, we'll stick with you. But you do the killing, Clyde, if you want these kids dead so badly. I will. And I will remember how you two were yellow-bellied cowards. So when do we do this? Frank asked, glancing up as the barmaid brought them all fresh beers on a tray. Waiting until she was gone, Clyde then said, tomorrow night, we go burn down her barn and run her horses off. Then, I want you, Frank, to go in and present her with the deed to sign, and remind her that if she does not, the lives of her sons are next. Perhaps that's all it will take, Frank commented, sipping his beer. No barn, no horses. And if the Indian tries to stop us? Clyde sat back, feeling his satisfaction fill him. I do hope he does. Then we kill him, and Widow Reilly is defenseless. She will sign the deed faster than it takes to hand her the pen. Chapter 13. I want to go to the sheriff, Rebecca said, pacing up and down the veranda. She fretted, worried, because David and Noah had ridden out to move the cattle further into the mountains to safeguard them. Until they were back safely, her stomach would be tied into knots. Is he a fair man? Shield asked. He sat in the chair, his hands busy braiding leather into a bridle. Yes, he is. I think he will listen to me. But will he listen to me? Shield eyed her sidelong. White men do not hold Indians as trustworthy or truthful. I think we have to try. Rebecca continued to pace, constantly glancing at the trail the boys took when they rode out earlier, waiting for them to return. However, she knew that would not be for hours yet. Not until late afternoon at the earliest. Perhaps we should ride into town then, Shield suggested. I think I am fit to ride now. Rebecca shook her head. We'll take the wagon. Slower, yes, but safer for you. Shall we go now? Hesitating, she glanced around at the peaceful yard, the chickens scratching in the dirt, the horses in the corral nibbling on the remains of their hay. She heard the pigs in their pen grunting as they, too, sought edibles they might have missed after their morning feed. No, she decided, folding her arms over her chest. Tomorrow. Then Noah and David will be here to protect the place while we're gone. If Foster shows up, they can lock themselves in the house. Shield nodded. You and your husband built a strong place. Besides, Rebecca added, snatching yet another glance toward the trail, I will worry myself sick over the boys. You will anyway. You're doing it now. She tried a smile. I can't help it. They're my sons. I am concerned for them, too. And I care about them. Finally sitting in a chair beside him, Rebecca rested her hand on his strong arm. I know you do. And they have grown fond of you. That is good, I think, Shield said, pausing in his work to gaze at her. For I am falling in love with their mother. Rebecca felt her heart swell with joy and happiness, knowing now, for certain, that his feelings for her matched her own for him. That pleases me, Shield, she murmured, leaning toward him. For I am falling in love with you as well. He bent, and closed his lips over hers in a long, tender kiss, tasting her, loving her, his mouth telling her without words just how much he cared about her. With slow long movements, he kissed her more deeply, filling her with sweet desire, an emotion she never thought she would feel again. Her hand traced up and over the scar on his neck, pulling him closer, breathing in his masculine odor. At last she pulled away from him, slightly embarrassed, yet exhilarated, looking at him and seeing the same sentiments on his own face. I never thought I would find love again, she whispered. I never thought I would find it in the first place. Shield took her hand within his strong ones. You taught me how to love, Rebecca. Not just the love of the land or my tribe, but the love I can feel within my heart. It is a gift I received from you. Hatred and evil cannot win. Nor will they. Hours later, David and Noah returned home as the sun set over the mountains, clattering toward the barn as Rebecca breathed her relief out in a huge gust. Shield nodded his own satisfaction that the boys returned safely. I will help them with the chores, he said, leaving his nearly completed bridle on the chair. Supper will be ready soon. With Shield sitting at the table as though part of the family already, Rebecca listened to Noah and David telling him about how they drove the cattle up into the higher elevations, while he in his turn told them some Indian legends. They listened in fascination, their mouths open and almost forgetting to eat. Finish up, David, Noah, Rebecca said. From now on, at least until we get Mr. Foster out of the way, you two stay here at the ranch. But we wanted to go hunting, Ma, David protested. That can wait. Tomorrow, Shield and I are going into town to see the sheriff. If anyone shows up, Shield added, stay in the house and away from the windows. He really won't come back, David said, frowning. Will he? Yes, he already did, Rebecca replied. And he threatened to harm you boys. So you will stay close to the house. If we're lucky, the sheriff will arrest him. Or at least threaten him into leaving us alone. All right, Ma, Noah said, cheerful. We have work we need to do in the barn. Don't we, David? Just make sure you don't get so involved in there that you don't watch the road or the hills, Rebecca warned them. We won't. The next morning, Noah and David helped harness the draft horse team to the wagon, and waved goodbye from the house's veranda as Rebecca and Shield drove down the road. They will be fine, Shield assured her when she kept turning to gaze back over her shoulder at them. Or I can stay here if you want. No. I want us to get to the sheriff before Foster has a chance to return. And, in truth, would appreciate your help in reporting this, she admitted, slapping the horses' rumps with the heavy reins to get them to trot faster. Until Foster is in jail, I will worry. It would not be very smart to attack in daylight, Shield said. A good warrior would wait until nightfall. You are assuming these people are smart, Rebecca replied tartly. Foster is arrogant, which means he could do anything. And his arrogance will work against him. Rebecca blew out her breath. So it will. Reaching town, Rebecca caught glimpses of Miners Creek folks watching them, some downright gaping. Though he wore white men's clothing, his long hair and copper skin made Shield stand out as a Cheyenne. He eyed Rebecca with no little amusement. It would appear they are not accustomed to my people in this village. Rebecca snorted. Closed-minded people so easily judge others. Noah told me about the old woman you cared for. Rebecca nodded. That was a good example. Tell me, what is a lady of the night? Blushing furiously, Rebecca shrugged. Oh, my, I suppose you have a great deal to learn about us white folks. A lady of the night is a prostitute. Oh. Shield nodded thoughtfully. The poor woman had her past held against her all her life, even when she married a decent man. I was glad to help her through the last of her illness. She died at peace. Rebecca reined in the team in front of the sheriff's office, Shield jumping out first and walking quickly around the wagon to help her down. Let's hope he is inside. Opening the door, Rebecca found the sheriff was indeed inside, his feet propped up on his desk and reading the paper. He glanced up curiously, and if he felt shock at seeing Shield, he did not express it. Instead, he lowered the paper and stood up. Mrs. Reilly, he asked, holding out his hand. Yes, thank you for remembering me. Sheriff Butler, this is Shield, a Cheyenne, my friend. Butler shook hands with Shield and gestured for them to take the chairs in front of his desk. Might I ask how this, friendship came about? I mean, it's not every day that young widows come see me with Cheyenne warriors. She and her sons saved my life. Shield displayed the wicked scar on his neck. I was attacked by wild dogs and would have died. They cared for me as they would their own. Sheriff Butler smiled, leaning back in his chair. Now that does not surprise me given it was Mrs. Reilly who cared for you. Our town is lucky to have her among us. So what can I do for you? Hunt down the dogs? They have been a plague lately. My boys killed the dogs, Rebecca replied, but that is not why we are here. I am being harassed and threatened. Butler frowned. By who? A man named Clyde Foster, she said, her anger rising even to talk about it. He is demanding I sell him my land and even dared threaten my sons' lives. That name is unfamiliar to me, Sheriff Butler said. Can you describe him? A weasel with thin white hair and wears a bowler. Comprehension crossed the sheriff's face. I know who you mean. A stranger in town, came in with 3 other fellows. I've been keeping them in my sights, as they have no apparent business in Miners Creek and are always hanging out in the saloon. Can you tell him to leave town? Rebecca asked, hopeful. Butler shook his head. No, but I can warn him that complaints have been filed against him and that he better watch himself. Shield glanced at Rebecca and back to the sheriff. Will that work? Butler shrugged. I can't do much more unless he commits a crime. And threatening my sons is not a crime? Rebecca knew her voice rose and seemed unable to halt it. So he can walk free and kill my boys? Butler made calming gestures with his hands, his voice quiet. He is trying to throw a scare into you, Mrs. Reilly. Once you show him you are not giving up, he will most likely pack up and move on. But he is harassing me, she cried, desperate. He stole our cattle. The sheriff's eyes narrowed. Can you prove it? Rebecca wilted. Probably not to your satisfaction. Butler leaned forward. I will pay a call on this Mr. Foster, ma'am. I will try to scare him into leaving you alone. Right now, it is the best I can do. Shield nodded. We were hoping that might be more that could be done, Sheriff. Are you helping to look after the Reilly place? Butler asked. Now that I am healed, yes. Good. Mrs. Reilly needs someone around. Rebecca stood, smiling a little. I apologize for getting emotional, Sheriff. You have nothing to apologize for, ma'am. Have a safe trip back to your place. After shaking hands with him again, Rebecca left the sheriff's office, Shield at her shoulder. Helping her up into the wagon, Shield commented, now if all white men were like the sheriff, I might come to like them. He was accepting, wasn't he? Yes. I half expected him to shoot me on sight. Not all whites are bad, Shield. He climbed up beside her, grinning. It just seems that my people run into the worst of them. Clucking to the team and slapping their rumps with the reins, Rebecca turned the team around to head west toward the ranch. Once again, they received the shocked stares of people they passed, Rebecca ignoring them even if Shield stared back. As they passed the saloon, she tried to see if the Foster road was tied up out front, but she did not see it. If he's a stranger in town, he is probably staying at the hotel and puts his horse up at the livery, she thought. Urging the big drafts into a quicker pace, Rebecca would not stop worrying about Noah and David until she reached home and found them safe. Chapter 14. Arriving home, which Shield found strange to think of as home, they discovered the boys were not just safe, but had cleaned the barn, made repairs to several fences that were threatening to collapse, and, as Rebecca guided the team toward the barn, were busy in the garden collecting the vegetables. I am going to have to leave them alone more often, Rebecca commented as Shield helped her down. They are determined you keep the place, Shield said. I think I know how to unharness these horses. Go in the house and get some food. Rebecca squeezed his hand. You are far too good to me. Shield found the myriad of buckles and clips that made up the harness a bit confusing until Noah arrived to help. Here, he said. Let me show you. Cheyenne do not drive horses and wagons. I know. You ride. I really like your Pinto. He is a well-bred horse. As Noah showed him how to unharness the team, Shield discovered the boy had a true eye for horses. After returning the drafts to their stalls in the barn, he and Noah walked to the corral, Noah pointing out the various points among his family's herd. Look at yours, Noah said, gesturing. Not just nice straight legs, but good sound feet. Without good feet, you got nothing. That is very true. His neck is set well, and his rump says he can jump a 4-foot split rail fence if he wanted to. Shield grinned. As a matter of fact, he does like to jump. His chest and barrel say he's got stamina. He does. Ours are not bad, Noah admitted. Just average, I'd say. One day, I want to breed horses. Get a few good stallions and a number of top mares. Breed horses like yours. That is an admirable ambition, Noah. Leaning against the top rail of the fence, Noah sighed. But we don't have the money to buy stallions or mares. And we'd have to build another barn, which we can't do. Maybe one day it will happen. As David and Noah went into the living room to read after supper, Shield and Rebecca washed the dishes. I can speak English, Shield commented. But I cannot read it. Maybe one day you will teach me. Rebecca grinned, but before she could speak, the sound of horses whinnying sent them both to the window. Dear God, she cried. The barn is on fire. Her panicked voice brought David and Noah on the run. We have to get the horses out. Noah hollered as they ran out of the house and into the darkness. Get buckets, fill them from the well, Shield yelled. But Noah ran on ahead and vanished into the depths of the burning barn. Noah! Rebecca shrieked. Shield saw that the fire was well established as he, Rebecca, and David filled buckets and threw them onto the flames. Smoke broiled up into the night sky, burning Shield's lungs as he tossed bucket after bucket onto the flames. Within moments, he knew it would spread and consume the entire place. Noah still hadn't appeared. They'd tried to douse the flames around the door, giving him a clear path out, but he hadn't come through. Now, Shield would go in after him. Noah, he yelled one last time. The barn doors burst open wide. Noah, riding one of the big drafts, bareback, galloped out of the burning structure amid the 5 or so horses that had been stabled inside. Rebecca sobbed her relief, throwing another bucket of water on the flames, making them hiss. I don't think we can save it, she cried, running back to the well to fill her container. Ma! Who are they? At David's shout, Shield paused, turning. Horses galloped down the trail from the mountains, 8 horsemen, in a line. At first, he feared it was Foster and his gang returning to kill them until the foremost riders rode into the light of the burning barn. "Little Wolf," he shouted. "Yellow Hawk. We came in search of you, Shield," replied Little Wolf, jumping from his horse. "We thought you were held prisoner here." "No, I will explain. Help us put the fire out." Rebecca and her sons gaped for a few moments as Shield's Cheyenne friends grabbed buckets and threw water on the blazing fire alongside them, running back and forth with Shield, preventing the fire from spreading further. They stamped on the embers, kicked aside wood that might still flare up. Within an hour, the fire was extinguished. Exhausted but grinning, Shield clasped arms with Little Wolf and Yellow Hawk. "You were a great help," he said, wiping bits of charcoal from his face. "What happened to you?" Yellow Hawk asked. "You did not come back, so we came in search of you. We thought you were a captive until you came running out to the fire." "We planned to attack this place," Little Wolf admitted, the eagle feathers in his hair stirring under the night breeze. "We saw white men come, run some horses off, then set the barn on fire." "Our other horses?" Noah cried. "How can we get them back?" Shield spoke in Cheyenne to the others. "Can you round up the horses? Maybe they have not gone far." The other 6 nodded and ran to their own mounts. Vaulting onto their horses, whooping, they charged into the night on the heels of the runaway horses. Rebecca walked up beside Shield, Little Wolf, and Yellow Hawk. "I don't understand, why would you help us?" "They thought you held me prisoner," Shield explained. "When they saw I was not, they came to help." "What happened to you?" Little Wolf asked, pointing to Shield's scar on his throat, clear in the glowing darkness. "Wild dogs," Shield replied. "The boys killed them, brought me here. This is Rebecca, she healed me. These young men are Noah and David, who also saved my life." Little Wolf smiled at Rebecca. "We must thank you for saving our brother. It was no trouble, really. Would you like to come inside?" The 2 warriors glanced at each other and shrugged. "We will. I'm going to stay here and wait for the horses," Noah declared. "I will stay with him," David added. "Come to the house and get your rifles first," Rebecca told them. Foster and his men might come back. The 2 ran ahead to the house to fetch their rifles as Rebecca and Shield led the way to the house. "Why are those white men burning your barn?" Yellow Hawk asked Rebecca. Entering the house, Shield briefly explained how Clyde Foster was trying to run Rebecca off her land. "They stole cattle, now burned the barn and set loose her horses," he said, sitting down. The 2 warriors, not quite as comfortable in the house as Shield, sat gingerly on the davenport as Rebecca went to the kitchen to get tea. "White men steal other white men's lands," Little Wolf commented, shaking his head. "Do they never stop?" "My brothers," Shield said slowly. "There is something I must tell you." He hesitated, then forged ahead. "I want to stay here with Rebecca." Yellow Hawk and Little Wolf exchanged glances. Then Yellow Hawk looked at Shield. "What of your people?" Again, Shield hesitated. Then he said, "I have accepted that I am half white." His Cheyenne brothers remained silent. "But that is not the reason," Shield admitted. "I have grown to love Rebecca." Little Wolf looked away. "She is a fine woman," Yellow Hawk said. "She would make a proud Cheyenne warrior." "Little Wolf?" Shield said. Little Wolf still said nothing. "I need your help," Shield went on, looking at both of them. "Will you stay nearby and camp? I know Foster will be back to kill Rebecca's sons then steal her land. Like he stole from us." Little Wolf frowned. "From us?" "He is the white man who chased us from our land and gave us nothing in return." "It is him?" Little Wolf asked, his face hardening into stone. Rebecca returned with hot tea on a tray, serving Little Wolf and Yellow Hawk their cups. They accepted, and Shield knew that without even trying, she had impressed his fellow warriors. "A good woman," Yellow Hawk said. "With strong sons." Rebecca blushed at his comment, grinning sheepishly at Shield. "Did you tell them?" "He did, Rebecca," Yellow Hawk replied. "We will help you in your war against this man who seeks to take your land." "Will you?" "Why, I would be very grateful. And in return, if you need help feeding your people, I will send them cattle to see them through the winter." That got Little Hawk's attention. "Then we will bring you gifts of hides and sacred tobacco," he replied. There will be a strong friendship between the Cheyenne and Shield's new family. Chapter 15. Feeling better and more confident knowing Shield's friends camped a short distance away, Rebecca went through her daily work, humming to herself. The Cheyenne had rounded up all the horses the previous night, and accepted bundles of food offered them by Rebecca. Though the barn was nearly destroyed, its main structure remained intact. David, after carefully examining it, thought it could be rebuilt. "If we have the money for lumber, that is," he added, his expression sour. "We will find the money," Rebecca told him. "Somehow. At least we are all still alive and have made new friends." Her satisfaction was short-lived, however, when a rider trotted his horse down the lane and into the yard. She and Shield glanced at one another. It was not Clyde Foster. She opened the door at the knock, Shield remaining hidden, out of the man's sight. Removing his hat, he extended a folded document to Rebecca. "This is from Mr. Foster, ma'am, with a message. He will return tomorrow, fully expecting this deed signed, giving him full title to this property. If you do not comply, your sons will be slain, along with your Indian friend." Rebecca picked up the rifle leaning next to the door and leveled it at the man. He backed up, just like Clyde had, his flesh paling to a pasty white color. "Tell your master this," she snapped. "When he comes to collect his property, he will be met with a rifle. And tell him he will die. Now get out of here." The man gulped and nodded, his hands high, as he hurried to his horse. Putting his hat back on his head, he nodded, almost respectfully, then swiftly mounted up. Like Clyde before him, he wasted no time in hitting a gallop and vanished down the road. Emerging from his spot, Shield commented dryly, "Yet another coward. Are you the only brave white person?" Had she not been so angry, Rebecca might have laughed. "If I am, my people are in serious trouble." Shield touched her arm. "I will go to Little Wolf and Yellow Hawk now, and make some plans. Foster will return tomorrow, and we must make certain he does not come again." Rebecca took his hand. "Come back to me." He bent and quickly kissed her. "I will." Once he had left, Rebecca summoned Noah and David to the living room. "Sit down, boys," she said, taking the armchair. After they had seated themselves, their eyes solemnly on her face, she drew in a deep breath. "Foster is coming back tomorrow. Shield and the Cheyenne are planning some kind of retaliation or trap, I'm not sure which. I want you both to remain inside, all day, for he threatened you specifically. Whatever happens, stay in your room. Promise me." "I promise, Ma," Noah said. "The Cheyenne said they would help us. How can Foster win when we have warriors on our side?" Rebecca stood and kissed his hair. "Just stay inside no matter what." David merely nodded, and Rebecca was too frazzled to make a note of it. Foster wasted no time in coming for his deed the next morning. Rebecca watched him and 3 others riding with him trot up the road toward the house. Picking up a rifle, she glanced at Shield, who had also armed himself. Noah and David were safely behind them, shut in their room, and Rebecca hoped they would abide by their promise to remain in there. Swinging the door wide open, she, with Shield at her shoulder, marched out onto the veranda. Lifting the rifle, she aimed it squarely at Foster's chest as he sat his horse, gaping. "I told you it was your time to waste, Foster," she said. "Now, you will ride back the way you came." "No, ma'am," he said, removing his bowler. "I came for what is mine." "You came for what is mine," she snapped. "I plan to keep it. Is it worth dying for? Is it worth your sons dying for?" Foster sneered, dismounting. "Frank, go around to the rear. Find the boys. The man who had come the previous day reined his horse around and kicked it into a lope, vanishing to the rear of the house. Rebecca felt a wriggle of fear etch its way down her spine. My boys are back there. He can get in through the door. I am warning you, Foster. Come closer and I will shoot you. And my man will kill your boys. He raised his voice. Frank. Yell out when you have them. Behind her, she heard the sound of the back door being kicked in. Unable to take her gun off Foster, who leered and stepped closer, Rebecca almost panicked, letting loose a shot. But if she killed Foster, what would the other man do to her sons? She exchanged a glance with Shield, who met her gaze calmly. She read nothing in them. No fear, only steadiness. Rebecca almost swung around at the sound of Noah's frightened and angry voice. Let go of me. I only found one kid, Clyde, came the voice from behind her. Well, bring him out. Foster grinned. Care to sign the deed now, Mrs. Reilly? Never, she whispered. Foster stepped onto the veranda, a mere foot from her. Sign or the boy dies. Suddenly, a loud and wild whoop erupted from Shield. It startled not just Rebecca, but Foster also turned toward him, alarmed. As Shield swung his rifle toward him, Foster knocked it aside with his arm. The rifle barked, the shot striking the floor. Instantly, Foster lunged at Shield, screaming, inarticulate, yanking a hunting knife from his belt. Rebecca tried to turn the gun on him, to shoot him before he could kill Shield, but the two men rolled on the floor, grappling with one another. She dared not fire for fear of hitting Shield. Reversing the rifle, she aimed to hit Foster on the head but hit his shoulder. He flung wild punches at Shield's face, and she knew Shield had not recovered enough to be able to hold his own in a fight. Lifting the rifle, she aimed down it, toward Foster's head. It was clear in her sight. The gun was knocked from her hand. Spinning, she found the man, Frank, just behind her, grinning, his pistol held to Noah's head. Don't, lady, he said. Or I'll kill the boy. Helpless, Rebecca looked to Shield under Foster's weight, his hand on the white-haired man's wrist. Foster's hand held the huge knife, edging closer to Shield's chest. If he plunged it in, there would be no saving the life of the man she loved. Shield grit his teeth, using all his strength to keep that knife from stabbing downward. A rifle barked. Foster suddenly sagged, his face growing slack. Shield pushed his knife hand back and shoved him off to roll across the floor. Rebecca, shocked, saw the round hole in Foster's head. The man had died instantly. Shield staggered to his feet, blood creeping down his cheek. What? She began, stunned into near immobility. The rifle barked again at the same time whoops and rifle fire came from outside the house. Men yelled and screamed amid the gunshots as the sound of a body striking the floor came from behind her. She spun around to see Noah, safe and dazed, staring down at the body of Frank at his feet. Noah? He silently pointed. David lowered the smoking rifle, his young face grim. I never promised to stay in my room, Ma. I didn't. Not knowing whether to laugh or cry, Rebecca staggered toward him on numb feet, and gathered him into her arms. You're safe. You're both safe. She barely registered that Shield stepped across Foster's body, or that Noah joined him on the wide veranda. The whoops of the Cheyenne continued, finally rousing her curiosity. With her arm around David's waist, Rebecca went outside to see the Indians riding in a circle around the two dead men in her yard, yelling their triumphant war cries. Shield lifted his arm. Little Wolf yelled something to him in Cheyenne, then led the band at a gallop to the trail. Though she could not see them from that vantage point, Rebecca imagined them riding up and into the mountains, returning to their home. David left her to join his brother in examining the dead men in their front yard as she leaned into Shield. I suppose I should send them to fetch the sheriff, she said. Yes. Abruptly, Shield left her side to return to the house. Torn between watching her sons, and wondering what he was up to, Rebecca finally followed him inside. What are you doing? "There is something strange about this man wanting your land," he said. "I want to know why." Rummaging through Foster's pockets, Shield stood with a piece of paper in his hand. He unfolded it, squinting as he stared down at it. "What is this?" he asked, impatient. "I cannot read it." "Let me see." Rebecca took it from him, studying it for a moment. Then she gasped. "I can't believe it." "Oh, my lord." "What?" She raised her eyes to his. "This says there is a gold deposit in the creek above this ranch. Right in the center of my land." "Gold? What white men crave." "Yes. If this is right, then all our problems are solved, Shield. We can mine this gold, have money. And Noah can have his horse breeding farm." She laughed through her tears. "We can have everything we need." Shield took her into his arms, kissing her deeply. "I have everything I need right here." Later, the sheriff came, and the dead bodies were hauled away. It was determined that both men were shot in self-defense. David trembled when he confessed to one of the killings, but the sheriff assured him that he wouldn't be tried, not in a case like this. It was unclear who killed the other man. Rebecca thought it was one of the Indians, but being unsure, she said nothing. The sheriff didn't push, and Rebecca got the clear impression that he didn't much care. The men had been outlaws and killers, and now they wouldn't hurt anyone else. In the stillness of the aftermath, Rebecca sat between her sons on the front porch. Shield had gone out to check again on the horses. "Is everything all right now, Ma?" Noah asked, his voice subdued. She smiled and reached over to ruffle his hair. "It is all right, son. Everything is all right now. You don't have to be afraid anymore." "I wasn't afraid," he quickly claimed. "Of course, you weren't." But she heard him sigh, and the three of them sat in silence for a long while. Finally, David spoke. "So. Shield is staying then?" "Shield is staying," Rebecca answered. Noah grinned. "I'm glad, Ma." Warmth surged in Rebecca's heart. "So am I." David nodded, and Rebecca watched him look out over the land, as if checking to make sure everything was in order. "Ma," he said. "Yes?" "I'm glad, too." Rebecca blinked back her tears, her heart filled with gratitude. "Then, we all agree." She reached out with both her arms, circling the shoulders of each of her sons. "I'm proud of you, boys. And your pa would be proud, too." "Ma?" "I think Pa would like Shield," Noah said. "Yes," she agreed. "I think he would like Shield, too." The end. Thank you for listening to this heartwarming story by Susannah Calloway. You can be assured that all her books are clean and wholesome. To find other romances by Susannah Calloway, as well as the other authors at Tika House Publishing, visit www.tikahousepublishing.com. Remember to hit like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next Susannah Calloway Western romance.